There is a quiet power in not responding. In a world that demands constant updates, instant replies, and emotional availability at all times, silence is now mistaken for hostility, or worse, guilt. But silence isn't an offense. It's a boundary. It's a pause long enough to breathe without explaining why you're out of breath. People often demand reasons for your withdrawal, not because they care about your well-being, but because they're uncomfortable with no longer having access to you. When you start pulling back, the most common question you'll hear is what's wrong. But nothing has to be wrong for you to reclaim your space. You don't owe the world a thesis statement for your peace. The expectation to narrate every emotional decision is a trap that keeps you tethered to others' comfort at the cost of your own. They want reassurance, closure, justification. But what you need is quiet, not permission to be quiet. Explaining your silence is often a way of seeking validation for your boundaries. But true strength comes when you stop explaining and start standing. Your silence is not a weakness. It's a recalibration. You are no longer filling gaps in conversations that don't nourish you. You are no longer cushioning people from the discomfort of your detachment. You are no longer trading your mental clarity for someone else's emotional convenience. And here's the truth. People who genuinely respect you won't demand explanations. They'll recognize your silence as a form of strength, not rejection. They will adjust to your absence without interpreting it as abandonment. But those who depended on your constant emotional presence, they'll resist it, because your silence breaks the pattern that kept them centered in your life. Even when they gave little in return. Silence is not absence. It is presence in a different form. It's a deliberate turning inward, a sacred pause that the noise of the world constantly tries to interrupt. But somewhere along the way, society taught us that silence must be justified, that choosing not to speak, not to text back, not to explain ourselves is rude, passive-aggressive, or immature, that unless we wrap our silence in an explanation, we are doing something wrong. But that's a lie rooted in entitlement. The truth is, people are not owed access to your thoughts just because they're uncomfortable without them. Silence is a boundary, not a betrayal. It's a moment of self-possession where your energy belongs to you and no one else. It's a refusal to rush into reaction, to spill out words in the name of social obligation, to comfort others at the expense of your own clarity. You're allowed to disappear to process. You're allowed to not reply right away. You're allowed to change the rhythm of your emotional availability without broadcasting it like a public service announcement. Constant communication does not equal connection. It often dilutes it. Some of your deepest realignments will happen in the quiet moments when you're not explaining yourself to anyone, but listening deeply to yourself. And here's something no one tells you. The people who demand explanations are often the ones who benefited most from your lack of boundaries. They're not worried about your well-being. They're panicked that they no longer have immediate access to it. Your silence disrupts the pattern. It removes the supply of emotional labor they've come to expect. That's why they try to frame it as avoidance, manipulation, or distance. But your silence does not need approval to be valid. It's a private act of power. It's where you return to your center, unfiltered by the expectations of others. It's how you reclaim space in a world that constantly tries to take pieces of you, bit by bit, under the guise of connection. Your quiet is not an apology. It is your reset. Let it be what it is, sacred, intentional, and yours alone. We live in a culture that equates availability with loyalty, as if being reachable 24/7 is proof of how much we care. But constant emotional access is not love. It's not kindness. And it's certainly not sustainable. Just because someone has your number, your social media, or a shared history with you, does not mean they are entitled to your time, your thoughts, or your emotional energy on demand. There is a dangerous myth that the more you give, the more you prove your worth. But this mindset turns your inner life into an open-door policy for people who haven't earned the right to walk through it. Some relationships function like subscriptions. They expect content, updates, attention, all without offering anything of value in return. And if you don't deliver, they feel cheated, as if you failed them somehow. But connection without respect is not connection, it's consumption. And you're not here to be consumed. When you grant people unfiltered, unlimited access to your emotional world, you start bleeding energy in invisible ways. Every "hey, can we talk?" Every long text that demands a response, every guilt-laced phone call you didn't have time for slowly chips away at your peace. You become emotionally bankrupt, not because you don't care, but because you gave without protecting what you gave from. And the truth is, real connection doesn't demand your constant availability, it honors your humanity. It respects that you have limits, a life, and an emotional ecosystem that needs rest, silence, and solitude. The people who truly value you won't need a 24/7 feed of your attention. They'll meet you in mutual time, in balanced spaces, with emotional generosity that mirrors your own. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to close the gate, not out of malice, but out of maintenance. Your soul is not a service. Your presence is not a product. And not everyone who shows up deserves to stay, especially not on a keycard they didn't earn. Intimacy is not just physical closeness or emotional vulnerability. It is access. It is permission. It is an invisible doorway into your internal world. But when that access is given without clarity, purpose, or mutual respect, it doesn't create connection, it drains you. And most people don't realize they're emotionally exhausted, not because they're doing too much, but because they're letting in too many. You can't build peace in a home where the doors never close. Letting people in emotionally, without filtering who they are, or why they're there, is like inviting strangers into your house and asking them to redecorate your mind. Their voices start to blend with your own. Their opinions start to shape your decisions. Their expectations begin to feel like obligations, and suddenly, you're carrying emotional weight that was never yours to begin with. Unintentional intimacy creates emotional leakage. You give parts of yourself to people who don't know how to hold them. You share your thoughts, your doubts, your dreams, without asking if they have the maturity, empathy, or investment to handle what you've handed them. You find yourself explaining your feelings to people who never asked to understand, venting to those who only listen out of habit, or oversharing to fill an awkward silence that should have stayed silent. The result? You feel hollow, you feel unrecognized, you feel strangely alone in relationships that are supposed to make you feel seen. Because there is a difference between being open and being exposed. One is intentional, the other is reflex. One builds trust, the other builds dependency. Emotional distance is not the enemy of closeness, it's the filter that makes real closeness possible. When you are intentional with your intimacy, you stop performing for approval and start choosing presence with purpose. You stop confusing response with care. You begin to understand that not every connection needs depth. Not every conversation requires vulnerability, and not every person you meet is meant to hold a part of you. One of the most emotionally paralyzing myths we're taught is that distance equals conflict. That if you walk away, reduce communication, or decide not to engage anymore, it must be because you're bitter, angry, or trying to punish someone. But healing sometimes looks like distance. Sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is step back, not because you hate them, but because you finally remembered to love yourself. Unfriending isn't always dramatic. It doesn't need an announcement or an argument. It doesn't need to end with a scene. In fact, the most powerful separations happen quietly. A shift in your spirit, a realization in your gut, a moment of clarity that whispers, "This isn't good for me anymore." You don't owe anyone the version of you that existed in your unhealed state. You don't have to keep performing peace just because it keeps others comfortable. When you unfriend someone, digitally or emotionally, it doesn't mean you wish them harm. It means you're done placing them at the center of your energy. It means you're choosing your alignment over attachment. You can grieve the connection and still walk away. You can remember the good and still recognize that it no longer serves you. Healing requires honesty, and honesty often reveals that some connections were only meant to last for a season, not a lifetime. But here's what makes this hard. You've likely been conditioned to prioritize harmony over truth. You've been taught to keep the peace, even if that peace costs you your sanity. So when you choose distance, guilt creeps in. You wonder if you're being too harsh, too cold, too selfish. But the real selfishness is allowing your emotional life to be dictated by fear of someone else's reaction. Unfriending isn't an act of revenge, it's an act of clarity. It says, I will no longer betray my own needs to maintain a relationship that doesn't honor them. It says, I can love who you were in my story, and still release you from my future. It says, I am no longer willing to shrink myself to keep something that constantly makes me feel small. Their quote, "It's an unspoken pressure in modern life to always be accessible, emotionally, digitally, socially. The moment we don't reply, don't pick up, don't engage, we're perceived as distant, rude, or cold. But the truth is, constant reachability isn't connection, it's captivity. And being unreachable is not a flaw in your character, it's a boundary in your emotional ecosystem." You are not a notification, you are not a lifeline for every crisis that wasn't created by you, and you are not required to always be on just because someone else is struggling to self-regulate. We live in an age where a delay in response is treated like disrespect. But your silence, your absence, your pause, it's not disrespectful, it's restorative. Being unreachable doesn't mean you've stopped caring, it means you've started caring for yourself. Often for the first time in a long time, the world doesn't teach this. Instead, it conditions you to feel guilty for unplugging, selfish for turning inward, and irresponsible for prioritizing peace over availability. But always being reachable is not a virtue, it's often a trauma response. It's the residue of needing to be needed, of being scared that if you disappear, so will your worth. But your worth is not tied to how quickly you respond, how easily you can be reached, or how many people rely on you. There is strength in quiet detachment, in letting your phone go unanswered, in not attending every argument you're invited to, in recognizing that your time and attention are sacred resources, not public utilities. When you choose to be unreachable, you begin to reclaim your rhythm, your solitude, and your voice. You stop living reactively, and start living deliberately. And here's what surprises most people: the world doesn't collapse when you step back. The people who truly value you will not be shaken by your silence, they will respect it. The ones who depended on your endless accessibility, however, will panic, because they weren't connected to your heart, they were connected to your availability, and when that's gone, so is their power over you. Their quote, "As a certain kind of person, who thrives not on connection, but on access to your energy, your empathy, your time. They feed off your need to care, to be helpful, to always show up. They don't nurture your spirit, they nibble at it slowly, and as long as you remain emotionally wide open, their presence feels normal, even necessary. But the moment you create distance, the truth begins to emerge. It's in the silence that you realize who was really there for you, and who was simply using you as an emotional outlet. When you stop initiating, the phone stops ringing. When you stop rescuing, the emergencies vanish. When you stop giving without pause, their affection turns to accusation. That's how emotional parasites operate. They don't love you, they love the way you made them feel, and the moment you no longer serve that function, they act as if you betrayed them. This revelation can be both painful and liberating. You begin to understand how many of your relationships were built not on mutual care, but on invisible transactions. Your attention in exchange for their validation, your labor in exchange for a hollow sense of belonging. These dynamics are rarely obvious while you're in them. They disguise themselves as closeness, but true closeness doesn't drain you, it doesn't guilt you, it doesn't vanish when you set a boundary. Emotional distance is the test. It filters out the dependent from the devoted. It reveals who respects your growth versus who resents your boundaries. Those who only came around when you were giving them something, your time, your listening, your problem solving, will begin to pull away. But don't confuse their absence with loss. It's not rejection, it's exposure. What remains after that emotional shedding is real. The connections that survive your silence are the ones that deserve your voice. The people who respect your emotional space without needing an explanation are the ones worth drawing close again. Everyone else was just borrowing your light, not walking with you in it. In a world that constantly asks for more time, more responses, more emotional labor, learning to protect your energy is not just self-care, it's self-command. It's the realization that your emotional state is the engine of your life, and if you let everyone drive it, you'll never reach your own destination. People think boundaries are barriers, but in truth, they are architecture. They are how you build a life where you can breathe. The hard truth is that many of us were never taught to manage our energy, we were taught to manage others' emotions. From a young age, we learned to people please, to soften our tone, to anticipate needs, to avoid conflict. We became fluent in overextending, mistaking burnout for generosity. And somewhere in that programming, we forgot that we have the right to our own emotional space. Not everything deserves a reaction. Not every demand requires a yes. Not everyone is entitled to your warmth on days you need it for yourself. Guarding your energy means making difficult decisions that may not be applauded. It means saying no when yes would be easier. It means choosing rest instead of rescuing, silence instead of explanation, space instead of constant closeness. Not because you're selfish, but because you're strategic about your well-being. Your peace is not a luxury, it's your baseline, and the more you allow it to be disrupted by unfiltered access, the more you lose clarity, focus, and purpose. This isn't about building walls, it's about recognizing the cost of being emotionally wide open in a world that constantly pulls at you. It's understanding that your presence is a privilege, not a product. When you lead yourself well, when you protect your time, guard your heart, and filter your interactions, you naturally begin to attract people who respect that strength. And just as importantly, you stop feeding the patterns that once kept you small, scattered, and overstretched. Self-leadership means you no longer abandon yourself to make others feel safe. You learn to sit with the discomfort of disappointing people, rather than carry the burden of disappointing yourself. You become the gatekeeper of your own emotional economy, not out of ego, but out of wisdom. Because once you realize how costly your energy is, you stop handing it out like it's free. There quotes a quiet wisdom that only shows up when the world goes silent. When you remove yourself from the noise, the constant conversations, the validation seeking, the performance of connection, you begin to hear something far more valuable, your own inner truth. Solitude isn't loneliness, it's listening. It's where emotional distance transforms from absence into alignment. It's where you stop reacting to others and start remembering who you are without them. Most people fear solitude because they've never been introduced to their unfiltered self. They're used to being seen through the mirror of someone else's gaze, shaped by approval, defined by role, affirmed by interaction. But when you remove that mirror, you begin to see what was behind it the whole time. Your instincts, your boundaries, your wounds, your wants. You begin to notice which voices in your head are yours, and which ones were planted there by parents, partners, critics, society. Discernment is not just knowing what you want, it's knowing what to let in. And you can't develop that skill when you're immersed in the very environment that confuses you. Solitude gives you emotional altitude. You rise above the swirl of reaction and begin to observe rather than absorb. You notice patterns, how certain people leave you drained, how certain conversations shrink you, how certain obligations aren't actually yours to carry. This clarity doesn't come from talking it out, it comes from sitting with it, from holding space for the discomfort until it starts speaking truths you've been too distracted to hear. Emotional distance makes room for discernment because it breaks the trance of dependency. You stop needing someone else to confirm what you feel. You stop waiting for external green lights to move forward. You start trusting your intuition as something sacred, not as something that always needs justification. And when you return to the world from this kind of solitude, you're no longer moved by every ripple in the water. You become the calm in it. You make decisions slower, but with more precision. You speak less, but your words land with more weight, because now, you're choosing from clarity, not chaos. Peace is often found in the relationships you release. We are taught to chase harmony through holding on to people, histories, roles and versions of ourselves that no longer reflect where we're headed. There's this deeply ingrained belief that loyalty means endurance, that if we just try harder, give more, or stay longer, the discomfort will transform into connection. But often the truth is quieter. Peace doesn't come from forcing relationships to fit, it comes from the courage to let them go. The moment you stop gripping the narrative that you should stay connected, out of guilt, habit, or nostalgia, you begin to understand that not all bonds are meant to last forever. Some were chapters, not lifelines. Some were meant to teach you, not accompany you. Some were beautiful in their time, but now ask you to shrink, just to maintain them. And there is no peace in shrinking. There is only delay. Delay in growth. Delay in alignment. Delay in becoming the version of yourself who doesn't apologize for needing space. We often associate endings with failure, but walking away isn't always walking out. It can be walking towards something, your clarity, your rhythm, your emotional sovereignty. Emotional distance grants you the vantage point to see what closeness concealed. You realize how many of your connections were based on obligation, rather than mutual nourishment. You see how many conversations were rooted in performance, not presence. And you begin to notice the invisible weight you were carrying, just to maintain an image of connection that felt more like survival than support. Releasing a relationship isn't about making the other person wrong. It's about honoring that you've changed. And sometimes connection doesn't evolve with you. And that's not cruelty, it's reality. Peace isn't passive. It's not a default setting. It's something you fight for by refusing to remain in places where your nervous system is constantly bracing. Sometimes peace looks like silence after years of noise. Sometimes it looks like a slow, gentle exit, instead of one final blowout. And sometimes it looks like disappearing from the life you once gave your everything to, because staying would cost you
your sense of self. Closing reflection. Emotional distance is not disconnection, it's direction. It's how you realign with your inner compass after years of being pulled in every direction, but your own. In a world that equates constant access with love, and endless availability with worth, choosing space can feel radical, but that space is where your truth lives. It's where your peace begins to whisper, your clarity sharpens, and your boundaries bloom. You don't owe closeness to everyone who once had it. Growth is not betrayal, silence is not weakness, and detaching is not abandoning. It's remembering who you were before the noise, before the guilt, before the conditioning that told you your value lived in being needed. So take your space, reclaim your time, protect your energy like it's sacred, because it is, and trust this, the more you learn to stand alone, the more you'll recognize who truly deserves to stand beside you.